The water reached Clara Foster's ankles before she even realized the creek had risen again, seeping through the gaps in the planked floor of her ramshackle cabin as the spring rains hammered down on the roof with relentless fury. She grabbed her mother's quilt from the narrow bed and lifted it high, watching helplessly as the muddy water crept higher, swallowing her few possessions in its cold embrace. This was the third time in 2 months that Willow Creek had overflowed its banks, and each time it happened, Clara lost a little more of what she had managed to salvage from her previous life. It was April of 1882, and Jerome Junction, Arizona, had seen more rain than anyone could remember in living memory. The copper mining town sat in a valley surrounded by hills that should have protected it from the worst of the weather, but instead, they funneled every drop of rainwater straight down into the creek that wound through the lower sections of town. Clara's cabin sat right on the edge of that creek, the cheapest property she could afford after her father died in a mine collapse the year before, leaving her alone at 19 years old with nothing but debt and determination. She waded through the rising water to the door, pushing it open against the current that now flowed freely across her floor. Outside, the world was gray and wet, the rain falling so thick she could barely see the outline of the buildings on higher ground. Her neighbors had already evacuated their homes, climbing to the main street where the water never reached. Clara stood in the doorway, her dark hair plastered to her face, her simple cotton dress soaked through, and felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over her shoulders. "Miss Foster," a voice called through the downpour, "you need to get out of there." Clara squinted through the rain and saw a figure on horseback, leading a second mount behind him. As he drew closer, she recognized Preston Fairbanks, the cowboy who worked at the Copper Ridge Ranch just outside of town. She had seen him around Jerome Junction plenty of times, always polite when their paths crossed, always tipping his hat with a smile that seemed genuinely warm rather than the leering grins she got from most of the miners. "I am fine," she called back, though the water was now halfway up her calves and still rising. Preston guided his horse right up to her doorway, and she could see the concern etched across his weathered face. He was probably 24 or 25, with sandy brown hair that curled at the edges beneath his wide-brimmed hat, and blue eyes that seemed impossibly bright even in the gloom of the storm. He had the build of someone who spent his days working hard, broad-shouldered and strong, but there was a gentleness in the way he held himself that Clara had always noticed. "No disrespect, Miss Foster, but you are not fine," Preston said, swinging down from his saddle with practiced ease. The water came up to his knees, but he did not seem to notice. "This cabin is going to wash away if the creek keeps rising. Please let me take you somewhere safe." "And where would that be?" Clara asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I cannot afford a hotel room, and I have nowhere else to go." Preston's expression softened. "Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house will let you stay until the water goes down. She is a good woman, and she knows what it is like to be alone in this world." "I cannot accept charity," Clara said, lifting her chin even as another wave of water surged through the cabin, nearly knocking her off her feet. Preston's hand shot out, gripping her arm to steady her, and even through the cold and wet, she felt the warmth of his touch. "It is not charity, it is common sense," Preston said firmly. "Please, Miss Foster, I cannot in good conscience ride away and leave you here to drown." Clara looked back into her cabin, at the water that now covered everything she owned, and felt something inside her crack. She had been so determined to make it on her own, to prove that she did not need anyone's help, but pride was a poor shield against a flood. She nodded slowly, and Preston's face flooded with relief. He helped her onto the second horse, his hands steady and respectful as he lifted her into the saddle. Clara had ridden before, back when her father was alive, and they had owned 2 horses of their own, but that felt like another lifetime. She gripped the reins with numb fingers as Preston mounted his own horse and led them both up the muddy slope toward the main street. The boarding house was warm and dry, a 2-story building painted white with green shutters that stood out like a beacon in the storm. "Mrs. Henderson," A plump woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, met them at the door with blankets and hot coffee. She took one look at Clara's bedraggled state and ushered her inside without a single question about payment. "You get yourself dry and warm, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, wrapping a blanket around Clara's shaking shoulders. "We will worry about everything else later." Preston stood in the doorway, water dripping from his hat and coat, and caught Clara's eye. "I will check on your cabin when the water goes down," he said. "See what can be salvaged." "You do not have to do that," Clara protested, but Preston just shook his head. "I know I do not have to," he said quietly. "I want to." Then he was gone, disappearing back into the rain, and Clara was left standing in the warm entrance of the boarding house, feeling more confused than grateful. She did not understand why Preston Fairbanks would go out of his way to help her. They barely knew each other beyond polite greetings on the street. Yet there had been something in his eyes, a sincerity that made her chest ache in a way she could not quite name. Mrs. Henderson showed her to a small room on the second floor with a narrow bed and a window that overlooked the street. Clara changed into a dry nightgown that Mrs. Henderson lent her and crawled under the thick quilts, but sleep would not come. She lay awake listening to the rain hammer against the roof and wondered what she was going to do when the water finally receded and she had to face the ruins of her home. The storm lasted 3 more days. Clara spent that time helping Mrs. Henderson with the cooking and cleaning to earn her keep, despite the older woman's protests that it was not necessary. On the 4th morning, she woke to silence and realized the rain had finally stopped. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now clean and dry thanks to Mrs. Henderson's kindness, and hurried downstairs. The town was a mess of mud and debris. The creek had returned to its normal size, but the damage it had left behind was extensive. Clara made her way down the slope to where her cabin stood, her heart sinking with every step. The structure was still standing, but barely. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the floor inside was covered in a thick layer of mud and silt. Her few pieces of furniture were ruined beyond repair, and the walls had warped from the water damage. She stood in the middle of what had been her home and felt tears prick at her eyes. She had worked so hard to keep this place, had scraped together every penny to pay the rent each month, and now it was destroyed. Again. "It is worse than I thought it would be." Clara spun around to find Preston standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He looked around the cabin with a grim expression, taking in the destruction with a practiced eye. "I am sorry," he said, meeting her gaze. "I was hoping some of your things could be saved, but—" "It does not matter," Clara said, wiping at her eyes quickly. "I did not have much to begin with." Preston stepped inside, his boots squelching in the mud. He moved around the small space, testing the walls and floor with careful hands. When he finally straightened, he shook his head. "This cabin is not safe, Miss Foster. The foundation has shifted, and another flood will wash it away completely. You cannot come back here." Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Where else am I supposed to go? This is all I can afford." Preston was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was hesitant. "I have been thinking about that, about you being down here by the creek, having to go through this every time it rains hard. It is not right." "Life is not right," Clara said bitterly, "but we make do with what we have." "What if you did not have to make do?" Preston asked. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "What if there was somewhere safer you could live?" "Preston, I already told you I cannot afford anywhere else in town. The only reason I could rent this place was because nobody else wanted it." "I am not talking about renting somewhere in town," Preston said. He took a breath, as if steeling himself for something difficult. "There is land on higher ground about a mile from here. It belongs to the ranch where I work, but it is not being used for anything. I could build you a cabin there, something small but solid, somewhere the water could never reach." Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to build me a cabin?" "Yes?" "Why would you do that?" Preston turned his hat in his hands, not meeting her eyes. Because every time it rains, I think about you down here by the creek, and I cannot stand the thought of you being in danger. I know we do not know each other well, Miss Foster, but I would like to change that. I would like to help you, if you will let me." Clara's mind was reeling. "I cannot ask you to do something like that. The time, the materials, the work involved. You are not asking, I am offering." Preston finally looked up, and the earnestness in his blue eyes made Clara's breath catch. "Please, let me do this." She should have said no. She should have thanked him politely and sent him on his way. But as she stood in the ruins of her flooded cabin, facing another uncertain night at the boarding house with no prospects and no plan, she found herself nodding. "All right," she whispered. "If you truly mean it, then yes. Thank you." The smile that broke across Preston's face was like the sun coming out after the storm. "I mean it, Miss Foster. I promise you that." True to his word, Preston began working on the cabin the very next day. Clara insisted on helping. Despite his protest that it was too much for her, she was stronger than she looked, hardened by a year of survival on her own, and she refused to simply accept his charity without contributing something in return. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, and as the days passed, Clara began to learn who Preston Fairbanks really was. He had grown up on a ranch in Texas, the youngest of 4 brothers. His family had lost everything in a drought when he was 18, and he had headed west to find work and send money back home. He had been in Arizona for 6 years now, working as a cowboy and saving every penny he could. He spoke about his family with love and longing, and Clara found herself sharing stories of her own childhood, back when her mother was still alive and her father came home from the mines every night with a smile on his face. The land Preston had chosen for the cabin was perfect. It sat on a rise that overlooked the valley, with Jerome Junction visible in the distance and the creek a thin silver ribbon far below. Wildflowers dotted the hillside, and the air smelled of sage and juniper. Clara fell in love with the spot immediately, and as the frame of the cabin began to take shape, she let herself imagine what it would be like to have a real home again. They talked while they worked, their conversations flowing as easily as the creek in springtime. Preston told her about the ranch, about the cattle drives, and the long days under the Arizona sun. Clara told him about her dreams of opening a small shop in town someday, selling the preserves and baked goods she made with recipes passed down from her mother. He listened with genuine interest, asking questions and offering encouragement, and Clara realized with a start that she could not remember the last time someone had truly listened to her. 3 weeks into the building project, Preston arrived at the work site with a wagon full of supplies and a sheepish expression. "I might have gotten a little carried away at the lumber yard," he admitted, unloading planks of smooth pine and bundles of shingles. "But I figured if we are going to build you a home, we might as well build you a good one." Clara ran her hand over the fine wood, marveling at the quality. "Preston, this must have cost a fortune." "I have been saving for years with no particular goal in mind," he said, shrugging. "Seems like helping you is a pretty good use of that money." She looked up at him. This man who barely knew her but was giving her more than anyone had given her in years, and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked softly. "Please, tell me the truth." Preston set down the bundle of shingles he was holding and took off his hat, running a hand through his hair. "The truth is, Miss Foster, I have been half in love with you since the first time I saw you walking down the street in town about 6 months ago. You had your head held high even though I could see you were struggling, and there was something about your strength and determination that just captured me. I never had the courage to speak to you properly until the flood gave me an excuse. I know this is fast, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I could not stand by and watch you suffer when I had the means to help. Even if you never return my feelings, at least I will know you are safe and dry." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sadness. "Preston, She did not know how to put into words what she was feeling. "I did not know. "I did not expect you to," he said quickly, "and I do not expect anything from you in return for this. The cabin is yours, no strings attached, but I would be lying if I said I did not hope that maybe someday you might consider letting me court you properly." Clara thought about the past 3 weeks, about the easy companionship they had developed, about the way her heart lifted every morning when she saw Preston riding up the hill with his tools and his ready smile. She thought about how safe she felt in his presence, how valued and respected, and she realized that what she felt for him was not gratitude, or at least not only gratitude. It was something deeper, something that had been growing steadily since the day he pulled her out of the flood. "Preston Fairbanks," she said, taking a step closer to him, "I would very much like it if you courted me, starting right now." The joy on his face was so pure and bright that Clara could not help but smile. He reached out tentatively, as if afraid she might pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "I promise I will do right by you, Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I will work hard and treat you with respect and do everything in my power to make you happy." "I know you will," Clara said, squeezing his hand. "I trust you." They stood there on the hillside, hands clasped and hearts full, and Clara thought that maybe, just maybe, her luck was finally changing. The cabin took another month to complete, and by the time they finished, it was more than Clara had ever dreamed of having. Preston had built it with love and care, with smooth plank floors and sturdy walls that would withstand any storm. There was a stone fireplace for cooking and warmth, real glass windows that let in the sunlight, and a covered porch where Clara could sit and watch the sunset over the valley. He had even constructed a small barn for a horse and chickens, anticipating Clara's needs before she could voice them. On the day they finished, Preston helped Clara move in the few belongings she had managed to salvage from the flood, plus some new furniture he had commissioned from the carpenter in town. A proper bed with a feather mattress, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair for the porch. Clara protested the expense, but Preston insisted, and she was learning that once he set his mind to something, there was no arguing with him. They stood on the porch together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The valley below was beautiful, and Clara could see Jerome Junction nestled among the hills, the creek winding past it like a ribbon. From up here, it looked peaceful and harmless, not like the destructive force that had upended her life. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "Preston, I do not know how I can ever repay you for this." "You do not need to repay me," Preston said. He was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling evening air. "Seeing you happy and safe is payment enough." Clara turned to face him fully, looking up into his kind eyes. "You have given me more than a home," she said. "You have given me hope. You have shown me that there are still good people in this world, people who care without expecting anything in return." "I do care," Preston said softly, "more than I probably should after such a short time. But Clara, you have become the most important person in my life. These past weeks working beside you, getting to know you, have been the happiest I have ever been." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "When I am with you, everything feels right. Everything feels possible." Preston reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and cupped her face gently in his hand. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Clara breathed, and then his lips were on hers, warm and soft and perfect. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but as Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed closer, it deepened into something that made her toes curl and her heart soar. She had been kissed before, quick stolen kisses behind the schoolhouse when she was younger, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had ever felt so right. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard. Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Clara Foster," he said. "I know it is too soon and too fast, but I cannot keep it in any more. I love you." "I love you too," Clara said, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. But as soon as she said them, she knew they were true. Somehow, in the span of a few weeks, this cowboy had become everything to her. "I love you, Preston." He kissed her again, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around on the porch until they were both laughing breathlessly. When he set her down, his eyes were shining with happiness. "Marry me," he said suddenly. "I know we have not been courting long, but I know what I want. And it is you. It has always been you from the moment I first saw you. Marry me, Clara, and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Clara's breath caught in her throat. Every practical part of her brain was screaming that this was too fast, too reckless, that she barely knew this man, but her heart was singing a different song. Her heart knew that Preston was good and kind and true. Her heart knew that she was safer and happier with him than she had ever been alone. And her heart knew that sometimes when you found something real, you had to be brave enough to reach out and grab it with both hands. "Yes," she said, watching his eyes go wide with wonder. "Yes, Preston, I will marry you." He let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed all the way down to Jerome Junction and kissed her again, harder this time, full of passion and promise. They stood on the porch of the cabin he had built for her, the cabin that had started as an act of kindness and become a symbol of their love. And Clara felt truly, deeply happy for the first time since her father died. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Jerome Junction, with Mrs. Henderson and the ranch owner where Preston worked as witnesses. Clara wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, with wildflowers from the hillside woven into her dark hair. Preston wore his best suit, looking handsome and nervous as he waited for her at the altar. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Clara with such tenderness that several people in the small congregation wiped at their eyes. They walked out of the church hand in hand into the bright Arizona sunshine, and Clara felt like she was floating. The ranch owner, a gruff but kind man named Samuel Turner, had given Preston 3 days off for a honeymoon, along with a bonus in his pay as a wedding gift. It was not much, but it was enough for Preston and Clara to spend 3 blissful days alone together in their cabin on the hillside, learning each other in the way that newlyweds do. Preston was gentle and patient with Clara, taking his time to make sure she was comfortable and cared for. Their first night together was awkward and sweet, full of whispered words and nervous laughter, but by the second night they had found their rhythm, moving together in the lamplight with increasing confidence and passion. Clara had never imagined that the marriage bed could be so wonderful, that the physical act of love could be both tender and fierce, comforting and exhilarating all at once. During the days, they worked on making the homestead more livable. Preston built Clara a chicken coop and surprised her by arriving home one evening with 6 hens clucking in crates tied to his saddle. Clara planted a garden, using seeds that Mrs. Henderson had given her as a wedding present. They talked about the future, about expanding the cabin someday to make room for children, about Clara's dream of selling her baked goods in town. "I have been thinking," Preston said one morning over breakfast, "what if we got you set up with a regular stall at the market in Jerome Junction? You could sell your preserves and pies on Saturdays. I checked with Mr. Turner, and he said he would buy anything you make for the ranch hands. They are tired of my cooking." Clara laughed, warmth flooding through her at his support of her dreams. "Do you really think people would buy what I make?" "Are you joking? Clara, your cooking is incredible. Those biscuits you made yesterday were better than anything I've ever tasted in a restaurant. You could make a real business out of this if you wanted to." The idea took root in Clara's mind, and over the following weeks she threw herself into experimenting with recipes. She made strawberry preserves and apple butter, peach pies and cinnamon rolls, sourdough bread and butter cookies. Preston was a willing taste tester for everything, offering honest feedback and enthusiastic praise. When she finally felt ready, he helped her load up a wagon with her goods and drove her into town for market day. The response was overwhelming. Clara's baked goods sold out within 2 hours, and she had to promise several disappointed customers that she would bring more the following week. She came home with a pocket full of coins and a smile so wide it made her cheeks ache. Preston swept her up in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing with the pure joy of success. "I am so proud of you," he said, kissing her soundly. "You are amazing, Clara Fairbanks." Hearing her married name still gave Clara a thrill. She was no longer Clara Foster, struggling and alone. She was Clara Fairbanks, wife of a good man, owner of a beautiful home on higher ground, and now apparently a successful businesswoman. Life was better than she had ever imagined it could be. The summer passed in a blur of happiness. Clara's baking business grew steadily, and she was soon making as much money as Preston brought in from the ranch. They saved every penny they could, dreaming of the day when they might buy the land the cabin sat on and truly own their home. Preston worked long days with the cattle, but he always came home to Clara with a smile and a kiss, ready to help with whatever needed doing around the homestead. In August, the rains came again, hard and heavy like they had in the spring. Clara stood on the porch of her cabin and watched the water rise in the creek far below, flooding the low-lying areas of Jerome Junction just as it had before. Her old cabin, what was left of it, was completely underwater. But up on the hillside, Clara and Preston were safe and dry, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the sound of rain on the roof that was comforting rather than terrifying. "Are you all right?" Preston asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on top of her head, and Clara leaned back into his solid warmth. "I am more than all right," she said. "I was just thinking about how different this is from the last time it rained like this, how scared and desperate I was, and now—" She turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Now I have everything I need right here." "We have everything we need," Preston corrected gently. "You and me together. That is all that matters." Clara kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally pulled apart, Preston was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "What is it?" she asked. "I have been thinking," he said slowly. "Mr. Turner is getting older, and he has been talking about wanting to retire soon. He does not have any children to leave the ranch to, and he mentioned that he might be willing to sell it to someone he trusts, someone who knows the land and the cattle and has proven himself to be a hard worker." Clara's eyes widened. "Preston, are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I have been saving for years, and with what you have been making from your baking, we might actually have enough for a down payment. It would be a risk, and we would have to work harder than ever. But Clara, we could own a ranch. We could build something real and lasting, something to pass down to our children someday." Clara's heart was racing. It was a huge decision, the kind that would change the entire course of their lives. But as she looked into Preston's hopeful eyes, she knew what her answer had to be. "Let us do it," she said. "Let us take the risk. I trust you, Preston, and I believe in us." The smile that broke across his face was brilliant. He picked her up and spun her around right there on the porch in the rain, both of them laughing like children. When he set her down, he kissed her with a passion that made her forget all about the storm raging around them. The negotiations with Mr. Turner took several weeks, but by September they had reached an agreement. Preston and Clara would buy the Copper Ridge Ranch in installments, with Mr. Turner staying on for the first year to help with the transition. It was a daunting responsibility, but Clara had never seen Preston so energized. He threw himself into learning every aspect of ranch management, and Clara continued to build her baking business, now supplying goods to several stores in Jerome Junction, as well as her weekly market stall. They worked from before sunrise until long after dark, collapsing into bed each night exhausted but satisfied. It was hard, grueling work, but they were building something together, and that made every aching muscle and long hour worthwhile. Clara learned how to keep the ranch books, tracking expenses and income with careful precision. Preston proved to have a natural talent for managing the cowboys and making smart decisions about the cattle and the land. By the time winter arrived, they were starting to see real profits from the ranch. Mr. Turner had moved into town, declaring that Preston had learned everything he needed to know and that the ranch was in good hands. On Christmas morning, Preston surprised Clara with a deed to the land their cabin sat on, having purchased it outright from the ranch's holdings as a gift. "It is yours now," he said, watching her read the document with tears streaming down her face. "Our home on land that we own. No one can ever take it away from you." Clara threw her arms around him, sobbing into his shoulder with joy and relief and overwhelming love. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything, for saving me, for building me a home, for loving me." "Loving you is the easiest thing I have ever done," Preston said, holding her close. "You are my whole world, Clara." They spent a quiet Christmas together, just the two of them in their cozy cabin, and Clara thought about how much her life had changed in less than a year. She had gone from being alone and desperate, watching her home flood for the third time with no hope in sight, to being a wife, a homeowner, a business owner, and a partner in a successful ranch, and all because a kind cowboy had refused to ride away and leave her in danger. In January of 1883, Clara realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when she finally missed her second monthly course, she knew for certain. She told Preston over dinner one evening, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. "You are going to be a father," she said simply, watching his face carefully. For a moment, Preston just stared at her, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. Then he dropped the fork with a clatter, jumped up from his chair, and pulled Clara to her feet, spinning her in a careful circle. "We are going to have a baby?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby," Clara confirmed, laughing at his exuberance. Preston knelt down and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach, as if he could hear the tiny life growing inside her. "Hello in there," he said softly. "This is your papa. I cannot wait to meet you." Clara ran her fingers through his hair, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "You are going to be a wonderful father," she said. "I am going to try," Preston promised, standing up and pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I am going to try so hard, Clara. Our child is going to have everything we did not. Stability, security, two parents who love each other, a real home." "They will have all of that," Clara agreed, "because of you, because you built us something on higher ground." The pregnancy was not easy. Clara was sick for the first 3 months, barely able to keep anything down. Preston was attentive and worried, bringing her ginger tea and crackers, rubbing her back when she was ill, and taking over most of the household chores without complaint. Mrs. Henderson came out to the ranch regularly to check on her, bringing advice and comfort from her own experiences as a mother. By the time spring arrived, Clara was feeling better and beginning to show. She had to let out her dresses to accommodate her growing belly, and Preston could not stop marveling at the changes in her body. He would place his hand on her stomach for hours in the evening, waiting to feel the baby move, and his face when he finally felt that first flutter was something Clara would treasure forever. "There is really a person in there," he said with wonder. "A little person that is half you and half me." "There really is," Clara said, covering his hand with her own. "Our little miracle." They spent the spring preparing for the baby's arrival. Preston built a beautiful cradle from smooth pine, sanding it until it was silky soft and carving their initials into the headboard. Clara sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands shaking slightly as she worked on garments for someone she had not yet met, but already loved more than life itself. They decided to add a small room onto the cabin as a nursery, and Preston worked on it in the evenings after his long days at the ranch. In June, just as the Arizona heat was becoming truly oppressive, Clara went into labor. It was a long, difficult process that lasted through the night and into the next day. Mrs. Henderson stayed with them, coaching Clara through the contractions while Preston paced nervously outside, occasionally coming in to hold Clara's hand and wipe the sweat from her forehead. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set on the second day, the baby arrived with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. Mrs. Henderson cleaned the infant quickly and placed the tiny bundle in Clara's arms, and Clara looked down at her newborn son with tears streaming down her face. "Preston," she called weakly, "come meet your son." Preston burst into the room, his face pale and drawn from worry, and stopped dead at the sight before him. Clara, exhausted but glowing with joy, holding a tiny baby wrapped in a soft blanket. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the small face peeking out from the blankets. "A son," he breathed. "We have a son." "Would you like to hold him?" Clara asked, and Preston nodded mutely. She transferred the baby carefully into his arms, and Preston cradled him like he was made of glass. The baby had stopped crying and was looking up at him with dark blue eyes, one tiny fist waving in the air. Preston touched that little fist with one finger, and the baby's hand closed around it instinctively. "Hello, little one," Preston said, his voice choked with emotion. "I am your papa, and that beautiful lady there is your mama. We are going to take such good care of you." They named him Samuel Preston Fairbanks, after the ranch owner who had given them their start and the father who loved him more than anything. Little Samuel was a healthy baby with a good set of lungs, and the first few weeks of his life were a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings. Clara was exhausted, but happier than she had ever been, and Preston proved to be a devoted father, taking over the baby's care whenever he could to give Clara a chance to rest. The ranch thrived despite the new baby, largely because Clara and Preston had built such a good team of workers. The Cowboys respected Preston's leadership, and Clara's organizational skills kept everything running smoothly even when she was busy with Samuel. By the time summer turned to fall, they were not only making their payments on the ranch but actually turning a healthy profit. Samuel grew quickly, transforming from a tiny newborn into a chubby, smiling baby who brought joy to everyone who met him. Preston would carry him around the ranch in a sling Clara had made, talking to him about the cattle and the horses as if the baby understood every word. Clara would watch them together and feel overwhelmed with love for her little family. On their first wedding anniversary, Preston and Clara stood on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset with Samuel sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms. The valley below was lush and green from the summer rains, and Jerome Junction looked peaceful and prosperous in the golden light. "Do you remember this day last year?" Preston asked, slipping his arm around Clara's waist, "when I asked you to marry me right here on this porch?" "I remember thinking I must be crazy to say yes," Clara said with a laugh. "We barely knew each other." "And now?" "Now I cannot imagine my life without you," Clara said, leaning into him. "You saved me, Preston. Not just from the flood, but from a life of struggling alone, of never having anyone to depend on. You gave me a home and a family and a future. You gave me everything." "You gave me just as much," Preston said, kissing the top of her head. "Before I met you, I was just drifting through life, working and saving money with no real purpose. You gave me something to work for, something to build. You gave me a reason to want to be a better man." They stood there together as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Samuel stirred in Clara's arms and made a small sound, and Preston reached over to stroke the baby's soft head with one gentle finger. "I have been thinking," Preston said after a moment. "In a few more years, once we have the ranch fully paid off and running smoothly, maybe we could expand the cabin even more, add another bedroom or two." Clara looked up at him with a knowing smile. "Are you suggesting we might need more bedrooms, Mr. Fairbanks?" "Well, Samuel's going to need siblings eventually," Preston said with a grin. "And I seem to recall you mentioning once that you always wanted a big family." "I did say that," Clara agreed, "though maybe we could wait until this one is sleeping through the night before we start planning the next one." Preston laughed and pulled her closer, careful not to wake the baby. "Fair enough. We have all the time in the world, Clara. All the time in the world." The years that followed were full and rich, marked by hard work and deep love. The ranch continued to grow and prosper, becoming one of the most successful in the region. Clara's baking business evolved into a small shop in Jerome Junction, run by a woman she hired and trained, that supplied baked goods throughout the area. The money from the shop gave them financial security they had never dreamed of, and they were able to pay off the ranch in full by 1886, 3 years ahead of schedule. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic toddler who loved following his father around the ranch. In 1885, Clara gave birth to twin daughters, Grace and Catherine, who had their mother's dark hair and their father's blue eyes. The cabin was expanded multiple times to accommodate the growing family, until it was no longer really a cabin at all, but a proper ranch house with 6 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a spacious living area. Preston proved to be as wonderful a father as Clara had known he would be. He was patient and kind, teaching his children to ride and rope and care for the animals, but he also made sure they learned to read and write, hiring a tutor to come to the ranch several times a week because the nearest school was too far for daily travel. He wanted his children to have opportunities he had never had, and he worked tirelessly to give them the best life possible. Clara balanced motherhood with her business ventures, though she had learned to delegate and trust others to help with the work. She still baked for special occasions and spent every Saturday at the shop in town, but most of her time was devoted to her children and her husband. She and Preston were partners in everything, making decisions together and supporting each other through the challenges and triumphs of building a life. In 1888, Clara became pregnant again, and in early 1889 she gave birth to another son whom they named Thomas. With 4 children under the age of 7, the ranch house was constantly full of noise and laughter and chaos. There were hard days when Clara was exhausted beyond measure, when the children were sick or cranky or fighting with each other, but there were many more good days, days filled with small moments of joy that made everything worthwhile. Preston was Clara's rock through it all. No matter how tired he was from working the ranch, he always made time for his family. He would read to the children before bed, his deep voice bringing stories to life. He would dance with Clara in the kitchen while she cooked dinner, making her laugh with his terrible singing. He would hold her at night and tell her she was beautiful, even when she felt worn out and frumpy from the demands of motherhood. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston surprised Clara with a trip to Phoenix. It was only for 2 nights, with Mrs. Henderson coming to stay with the children. But it felt like an incredible luxury. They stayed in a nice hotel, ate in a proper restaurant, and spent hours walking around the city hand in hand like they were courting again. On the 2nd night, as they were getting ready for bed, Preston pulled out a small box and handed it to Clara. Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant shaped like a house. "It is supposed to represent our home," Preston explained as Clara lifted the necklace from the box with shaking hands. "The home I built for you on higher ground. I know it started as just a cabin, a shelter from the floods, but it became so much more than that. It became a place where we built our family and our life together. I wanted you to have something to remember how far we have come." Clara threw her arms around him, the necklace clutched in one hand. "I love it," she said, tears running down her face. "I love you. Preston, these have been the best 10 years of my life." "Mine too," Preston said, holding her close. "And we have so many more years ahead of us, so many more memories to make." He fastened the necklace around her neck, and Clara looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was different from the desperate 19-year-old who had stood in a flooding cabin with no hope for the future. This woman was confident and loved and secure. She had a husband who adored her, children who filled her life with joy, and a home that could weather any storm. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. In 1891, Preston's mother passed away in Texas, and he traveled back for the funeral with a heavy heart. Clara wanted to go with him, but someone needed to stay and manage the ranch and care for the children. When he returned 2 weeks later, he was quiet and withdrawn, grieving not just for his mother, but for all the years he had missed with his family while he was building his life in Arizona. Clara helped him through his grief with patience and love, holding him when he cried and listening when he needed to talk. Slowly, he came back to himself, though the loss left a mark on him. He began writing more letters to his brothers in Texas, determined to maintain those connections even across the distance. In 1893, a drought hit Arizona hard. The creek that had once flooded so regularly dried up to barely a trickle, and the grass on the hillsides turned brown and brittle. It was a difficult time for all the ranchers in the area, and many lost cattle to the lack of water and grazing. But Preston had spent years preparing for such eventualities. He had dug wells on the property and stored feed for emergencies, and while the ranch took a financial hit, they survived when others did not. Clara's shop in town also suffered during the drought, as people had less money to spend on luxuries like baked goods. But Clara had diversified over the years, and the shop also sold basic staples like bread and flour that people needed regardless of the economic situation. They tightened their belts and cut back on expenses, but they never went hungry, and they never missed a meal. The children were growing up fast. Samuel, now 10 years old, was already helping his father with the cattle like a seasoned ranch hand. The twins, Grace and Catherine, were 8 and showing distinct personalities. Grace was quiet and studious, always with her nose in a book, while Catherine was adventurous and wild, constantly getting into mischief. Little Thomas, now 4, followed his older siblings around like a puppy, desperate to be included in their games. In 1894, the rains finally returned, breaking the drought. The hillsides turned green almost overnight, and the creek swelled with rushing water. Preston and Clara stood on their porch watching the water rise far below, and Clara shuddered as she remembered what it had been like to live down there in the path of the flood. "What are you thinking about, Mern?" Preston asked, noticing her expression. "About how different my life could have been," Clara said. "If you had not stopped that day in the rain, if you had not offered to build me a cabin on higher ground, I would probably be dead, Preston. Or at best, still struggling and alone and desperate." Preston pulled her close. "I could not have ridden away even if I wanted to," he said. "From the moment I saw you standing in that doorway with the water rising around you, I knew I would do whatever it took to keep you safe. It was not even a choice, Clara. It was just necessary, like breathing." "I am so grateful that you stopped," Clara said, turning to face him fully. "I am grateful every single day for you, for our life, for our family. You gave me everything, Preston." "We gave each other everything," Preston corrected gently. "I could not have built this life without you. You are my partner, Clara, my equal. Never forget that." They kissed there on the porch, a sweet, lingering kiss that held 15 years of love and partnership and devotion. Behind them, they could hear the children arguing about something inside the house, and they pulled apart with matching smiles. "Duty calls," Clara said with a laugh. "It always does," Preston agreed, taking her hand. "Come on, let us go referee whatever disaster is unfolding in there." They went inside together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next. Because that was what they did. They faced everything together on the solid foundation they had built on higher ground, far from the floods that had once threatened to wash Clara away. The children continued to grow and thrive. Samuel proved to have his father's talent for ranching and his mother's head for business. By the time he was 16, he was essentially running half the ranch operations himself, and Preston joked that the boy would probably be a better rancher than he was. Samuel just laughed and said he had learned from the best. The twins went off to a boarding school in Phoenix when they were 14, both of them eager for education beyond what the ranch tutor could provide. Preston and Clara missed them terribly, but they were proud of their daughter's ambition and determination. Grace wanted to be a teacher, while Catherine dreamed of being a doctor. An ambitious goal for a woman in the 1890s, but not impossible, with enough determination and family support. Thomas, now 10, was showing signs of being the artist of the family. He was constantly drawing pictures of the ranch, the animals, his family. Clara saved every scrap of paper he drew on, treasured evidence of his talent. Preston encouraged him, buying him proper art supplies from Phoenix and praising even his most primitive efforts. In 1899, Clara became pregnant again, a surprise at 36 years old. She and Preston had assumed their family was complete, but nature had other plans. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, with more aches and pains and exhaustion. But in early 1900, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl they named Rose, because she was the flower that bloomed at the end of their family. Rose was doted on by everyone, the baby of the family, and spoiled accordingly. Samuel, now a grown man of 17, was surprisingly gentle with his baby sister, carrying her around the ranch and making her laugh with silly faces. Thomas drew picture after picture of her, capturing her baby features in charcoal and ink. Preston, now in his early 40s, was as devoted a father to Rose as he had been to all his other children. Clara would often find him in the nursery late at night, just watching the baby sleep with an expression of wonder on his face. "I still cannot believe we get to do this again," he said one night when Clara found him standing over the cradle, "that we are blessed enough to have another child to love and raise." "We are very lucky," Clara agreed, slipping her arm around his waist. Lucky in so many ways. She was thinking not just of their children, but of everything they had built together. The ranch was now one of the most successful in Arizona, with a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealings. Clara's shop in Jerome Junction had expanded to 3 locations throughout the territory. They had money in the bank, a beautiful home, and a family that filled that home with love and laughter. Most importantly, they had each other. After 17 years of marriage, Clara and Preston were still deeply in love. They still held hands when they walked. They still stole kisses in quiet moments. They still talked late into the night about their dreams and plans and hopes. The passion of their early days had mellowed into something deeper and more enduring, a love that had been tested by time and hardship and emerged stronger for it. In 1902, Samuel married a local girl named Emily Harrison, and Preston and Clara became in-laws. The wedding was held at the ranch with half of Jerome Junction in attendance. Clara cried happy tears as she watched her firstborn son exchange vows with his bride, and Preston stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders, both of them marveling at how quickly time had passed. Samuel and Emily built a house on the far end of the ranch property, and Samuel took over more and more of the day-to-day operations as Preston began to ease into semi-retirement. Preston was only in his mid-40s, but years of hard ranch work had taken their toll on his body. He still worked every day, but he was grateful to share the load with his capable son. In 1903, the twins graduated from their boarding school. Grace took a teaching position in Jerome Junction, moving back home and delighting Clara with her presence. Catherine, true to her dreams, enrolled in a nursing program in Phoenix with the goal of eventually becoming a doctor. It would be a long, difficult road, but Preston and Clara supported her fully, both emotionally and financially. Thomas, now 14, was becoming a truly talented artist. He had started taking commissions for portraits and landscapes, and people were actually paying good money for his work. Preston and Clara encouraged him to pursue his passion, even though it meant he would probably not follow in his father's footsteps as a rancher. "Not every child has to want what we want," Preston told Clara one evening as they discussed Thomas's future. "He has his own path to walk, and we should support him in following it." "I know," Clara said. "It is just strange to think that none of our children might carry on the ranch after Samuel. Grace wants to teach, Catherine wants to be a doctor, Thomas wants to be an artist, and Rose is only 3, so who knows what she will want to do." "Samuel will carry on the ranch," Preston said, "and maybe one of his children will take over after him. Or maybe they will sell it someday and it will belong to someone else." "That is all right, Clara. We built this place for our family, and it has served that purpose. Whatever happens to it after we are gone does not change what it meant to us while we were here." Clara knew he was right, but it still made her a little sad to think of the ranch without Fairbanks' children running around. Then Rose toddled into the room, her face covered in jam from raiding the kitchen, and Clara laughed and scooped her up, deciding to worry about the distant future some other day. In 1905, Clara turned 42 and Preston turned 48. They were middle-aged now, with grown children and even a grandchild on the way, as Emily was pregnant with Samuel's first baby. Clara's hair was starting to show threads of silver, and Preston's was more gray than brown now. They both had lines on their faces from years of squinting into the Arizona sun, and their bodies were not as quick or strong as they once had been, but they were happy. Deeply, contentedly happy in a way that Clara had never imagined possible when she was a desperate teenager standing in a flooding cabin. She thought about that girl sometimes, about how scared and alone she had been, and she wished she could go back and tell her that everything was going to be all right, that a cowboy on a horse was coming to save her, and not just from the flood, but from a life half-lived. Preston's grandson was born in June of 1905, a healthy boy that Samuel and Emily named James. Watching Preston hold his grandson for the first time, seeing the joy and pride on his face, made Clara fall in love with him all over again. He was still the kind, generous man who had built her a cabin on higher ground all those years ago, just grayer and more weathered by time. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in August of 1907, throwing a big party at the ranch for friends and family. All of their children were there except Catherine, who was too busy with her nursing training to make the trip from Phoenix, though she sent a long letter full of love and congratulations. The house was full of people and food and laughter, and Clara looked around at everything they had built, everyone they loved, and felt overwhelming gratitude. That night, after all the guests had left and the children had gone to bed, Preston and Clara walked up the hill behind the house to the spot where the original cabin had stood. They had expanded so much over the years that the original structure was now just the core of a much larger house, but this spot, this particular piece of ground, was where it had all started. "Do you remember the day we finished building this place?" Preston asked, pulling Clara close in the moonlight. "How we stood right here and I asked you to marry me?" "I remember," Clara said. "I remember thinking I must be insane to agree. We barely knew each other." "And now we have known each other for 25 years, Mr. Preston said. "A quarter of a century, Clara. Can you believe it?" "Barely," Clara admitted. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you pulled me out of that flood. Other times it feels like a whole different lifetime. Like that scared girl in the flooding cabin was someone else entirely." "She was someone else," Preston said. "You are not that girl anymore, and I am not that impulsive cowboy who decided to build a cabin for a woman he barely knew. We have both changed and grown, but the core of what we are to each other, that has never changed. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I will love you until the day I die." Clara reached up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "I love you too, Preston Fairbanks. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for building me a home on higher ground. Thank you for giving me a life beyond my wildest dreams." "Thank you for saying yes," Preston said. "Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for being my partner in everything. I could not have asked for a better wife, a better mother for my children, or a better friend." They kissed there in the moonlight, on the hillside where their home stood solid and strong, and Clara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, about the floods that had threatened to destroy her, and the cowboy who had refused to let that happen, about the cabin that had become a house, that had become a home filled with love and children and 25 years of memories. Life was not always easy. They had faced droughts and financial struggles, sickness and death, worries about their children and their future. But through it all, they had faced everything together, on the solid foundation they had built together. Preston had given Clara a home on higher ground, but Clara had given Preston something just as valuable, a reason to build it, a purpose beyond mere survival. They had saved each other in ways that went far beyond the physical, and that mutual salvation had blossomed into a love that had stood the test of time. The years continued to pass, bringing more grandchildren and new challenges and small joys. Samuel and Emily had 3 more children, filling their house with noise and laughter. Grace married a fellow teacher and settled in Jerome Junction, starting her own family. Catherine eventually did become a doctor, one of the first female physicians in Arizona, and she opened a practice serving the mining communities that dotted the territory. Thomas sold his first painting to a gallery in Phoenix and began to make a name for himself as an artist. And Rose, the baby of the family, grew into a bright, curious girl who loved learning and had already announced at age 7 that she wanted to be a rancher like her father and brother when she grew up. Preston and Clara settled into the role of grandparents with enthusiasm, delighting in spoiling their grandchildren in ways they had never spoiled their own children. Their home was always full of family, especially on holidays when everyone gathered for big meals and loud celebrations. The ranch continued to prosper under Samuel's management, and Clara finally sold her bakery shops, deciding at 50 that she had earned the right to slow down and enjoy her family. In 1915, Preston and Clara celebrated their 33rd anniversary. Preston was now 58 and fully retired from active ranch work, though he still rode out to check on the cattle most days, unable to fully give up the life he had lived for so long. Clara was 52, her hair more silver than dark now, her face lined with the evidence of a life fully lived. They sat on the porch of their home, the same porch where Preston had first kissed her all those years ago, and watched the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold. "Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if I had not stopped that day?" Preston asked. It was a question he had asked before over the years, usually on their anniversary or when he was feeling particularly reflective. "Sometimes," Clara admitted, "but not in a dwelling way, more just marveling at the difference one moment can make. One decision. If you had ridden past, if you had decided helping me was too much trouble, if I had refused your offer out of pride, everything would be different. I would be different." "Or you would not be at all," Preston said quietly. "That cabin was going to wash away eventually. If you had stayed there, if you had kept living in flood zone—" "But I did not," Clara interrupted, taking his hand. "Because you stopped, because you cared enough about a stranger to offer help, and because I was smart enough, or desperate enough, to accept it. We both made choices that day that led us here, to this porch, to this life. And I am grateful every single day that we made the choices we did." Preston lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I am grateful too. For you, for our children, for our grandchildren, for every moment we have had together. I would not trade this life for anything in the world." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The valley below was peaceful, and the creek, that same creek that had once threatened to destroy Clara's life, was just a thin silver line in the distance, glinting in the last rays of sunlight. In that moment, Clara felt perfectly content. She had everything she had ever wanted and more than she had ever dared to dream. She had a man who loved her faithfully and completely. She had children who had grown into good, successful adults. She had grandchildren who filled her life with joy. She had a beautiful home that had stood strong for over 30 years, weathering every storm that came its way. Most importantly, she had learned what it meant to be truly safe. Not just physically safe from floods and danger, but emotionally safe in the knowledge that she was loved and valued and cherished. Preston had built her a shelter on higher ground, but together they had built a life that was even more secure than any structure of wood and stone. Rose came running out onto the porch, now 12 years old and full of energy. "Mama, Papa, supper is ready. Grace sent me to fetch you." "We will be right there, sweetheart," Clara said, smiling at her youngest daughter. Rose went back inside and Preston stood, offering his hand to help Clara to her feet. She took it, allowing him to pull her up, and they stood there for a moment, hand in hand, looking at each other with the easy affection of 3 decades together. "Ready for another family dinner?" Preston asked with a grin. The house was full tonight, with Grace and her family visiting along with Samuel and his brood. "Always, Shree," Clara said, "as long as I have you by my side." They walked into the house together, into the warmth and noise and love that filled every room. And as Clara took her seat at the head of the table, surrounded by her family, She silently thanked the universe for that rainy day in 1882 when a cowboy on a horse decided that one woman's safety was worth the effort of building her something on higher ground. Because that one act of kindness had changed everything. It had given Clara a future when she had none. It had given Preston a purpose and a family. It had brought two people together who might never have crossed paths otherwise, and from that meeting had grown a love that had lasted a lifetime. The floods had come and gone over the years, the creek rising and falling with the seasons. But up on the hillside in the home that Preston had built with his own hands, Clara and her family remained safe and secure far above the reaching waters. It was a testament to Preston's love and Clara's courage, a physical manifestation of what two people could build together when they faced the world as partners. Years later, when Clara was in her 70s and Preston was nearing 80, they would still sit on that porch and watch the valley. Their children were grown with families of their own. Their grandchildren were having children. The ranch had passed fully to Samuel, and the house had been expanded yet again to accommodate the growing family that gathered there for holidays and celebrations. Preston's health was beginning to fail, his body finally giving in to decades of hard labor. But his mind was sharp, and his love for Clara had never dimmed. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1932, with family gathered from all over Arizona to celebrate, Preston stood and made a toast. 50 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I married the bravest woman I have ever known. She was facing impossible circumstances, but she never gave up hope. She accepted my help when pride might have made her refuse. She trusted me when she had no reason to. And she built a life with me that has exceeded every dream I ever had. Clara Fairbanks, you are the love of my life, my partner in everything, and the best thing that ever happened to me. Here is to 50 more years, if the good Lord is willing. Clara smiled through her tears, standing to kiss her husband while their family cheered. She knew they would not get 50 more years. She knew their time was growing short. But she also knew that whatever time they had left, they would spend it together, just as they had spent every day for the past 5 decades. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later at the age of 76. Clara held his hand as he took his last breath, whispering words of love and gratitude for the life they had shared. She grieved deeply, missing him with an ache that never fully went away. But she took comfort in knowing that they had used every moment they had been given together. Clara lived for another 6 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her final years in the house on the hillside, the house that Preston had started building for her all those years ago. When people asked her about her life, about the secret to the happiness she had found, she always told them the same thing. Find someone who will build you something on higher ground, she would say. Not just a physical shelter, but an emotional one. Find someone who sees you struggling and refuses to look away. Find someone who offers help without expecting anything in return. Find someone who builds you up instead of tearing you down. And when you find that person, be brave enough to accept what they are offering, even if it seems too good to be true. Clara passed away in the spring of 1940, surrounded by family in the home she loved. She was buried next to Preston on the hillside on the exact spot where he had proposed to her 58 years earlier. Her children erected a simple headstone that read, Clara Fairbanks, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She found shelter on higher ground. The house stood for many more decades, passed down through generations of Fairbanks' children. And though the original cabin was now buried deep within layers of additions and renovations, the foundation that Preston had laid remained solid and true, supporting the structure just as his love had supported Clara throughout their life together. It was a legacy of love and protection, of one man's refusal to ride past a woman in need, and of the incredible life that grew from that single act of compassion. And far below, in the valley where Jerome Junction still stood, the creek continued to flood every spring when the rains came heavy, but the people who lived on higher ground in the homes built to withstand the rising waters remained safe and dry, sheltered from the storm.